Speak up, speak out, let's talk about it. Welcome to the show where you can show your love, no doubt about it. Where self-love and self-worth are the topics of the day. Right here on the Just Blah Show, where love is the only way. And here are your hosts, Barb and Faye.
This is Barb.
And this is Faye. Today we're talking about compassion. We're going to touch upon a couple of the components of compassion. We're going to probably or hopefully get to individual identity, honesty, acceptance, and what empathy is. And we'll also even talk a little bit about sympathy and willingness. And so I'm going to have Barb just start just giving a little bit of explanation of her understanding of what compassion is. And here's Barb.
Hi, everybody. So I've been looking at compassion for a little bit over a year. It kind of keeps coming up in other practices of gratitude and some of the different components of unconditional loving. So compassion really is just a living, breathing, profoundly complex, human experience. And it represents the mind, body, spirit connection in its fullness. So really, sympathy is pretty straightforward. I guess I shouldn't say it's pretty straightforward, but sympathy is basically not having the capacity to connect with somebody on any of the levels and basically making a judgment and saying something along the lines, oh, you poor thing, or that's too bad. And it's really just brushing it off and not making a connection on the mind-body spirit connection. And so empathy, I really want to take a little bit of time to explain that, because empathy is the gateway into compassion. And so empathy, how I understand it, is that it's when somebody's having an emotional reaction and they're talking to you about it. So let's say you're really angry and you're coming to me and you're like, man, I'm super angry. And then I get, it triggers my anger. And then I get into the empathy connection because of your anger is triggering my anger through your experience. And I'm making it my story. So now we're both in the anger mode, and so we're really just going in this downward spiral of being angry together, and it feels good because we have somebody validating us in our anger and experiencing it with us, although the stories are really separate. And so what compassion is the ability to have the empathy and recognize that, oh yes, I understand that you're having angry, but not attaching to it and bringing up your anger as well, and creating a space and being a loving presence to be able to hear the other person speak about their anger without you attaching to the story or bringing your own triggers up and experiencing it with them. Really, truly being an active listener for them. And that gives you the mind, body, and it can give you the spiritual connection as well. Did I explain that all right for you?
Yeah, I think so. And then in the other part of this would be sympathy. They're in the same wheelhouse, let's say. Mm-hmm. So if you could discuss maybe a little bit about sympathy and what the differences are between empathy and sympathy. It's really two things that people really kind of interchange, but they're really not they're not the same thing.
No, so sympathy really lends to a dependency and a weakness. Like that's what we focus on, and it can create like that sense of judgment from the person receiving the message, like I said, like you poor thing, and it really doesn't lift the other person out of their darkness or their direness, and it rather increases the experience of suffering for the person. In sympathy, they're feeling isolated in their connection with you, meaning that they're, I imagine, feeling judged by you, rather accepted and being nurtured, or at least seen in your suffering if you're the one, sharing.
I see. And how does that show up? I mean, can you give an example of what if somebody was saying from an empathy point of view and a sympathy point of view? I think that's the right way to ask it.
So you want an example of what sympathy and empathy are?
Yes, like if you were to say you approach someone or somebody approaches you and you see that they're not feeling well or something along that line, what would you say that would be sympathetic versus empathetic?
So sympathy is like, oh, you poor thing, that you must feel horrible, right? Empathy would be like, well, feeling sick is kind of like a feeling expression is like, I don't feel good, or I feel really, what's the word I'm looking for? It's like, I feel when you express yourself in a feeling of when you don't feel good, it's like, I just feel really sluggish today. And so you would say something along the lines of, it's like, oh yeah, I don't feel well. I feel sluggish too. And oh man, yeah, I totally get how you feel.
Your pain.
Yeah. So instead of seeing the person in their pain, so compassion would be like, wow, I can imagine that feels really uncomfortable. Tell me more about that. And that would be expressing an interest in their feeling about feeling sick or sluggish. And it's not taking that feeling on. Whereas empathy, you're like, oh, me too. Let me tell you about my experience about feeling sluggish. So you actually take the focus off the person sharing and putting it on you. And it becomes that struggle of trying to get, now you're in the empathy pool and you're both trying to get validation for feeling sluggish.
And that's where some people get mixed up in the difference. Like, they believe they're being compassionate, but in reality, they're being empathetic. Is that correct?
Yeah.
It's a component of compassion, but
you do need to have empathy to experience compassion, because compassion requires empathy, meaning identifying with somebody's feelings. But the difference is that the empathy is, I'm not making the story about me as the listener.
So I guess the goal in compassion is really not to absorb what the other person is feeling, but to identify with it, probably because you've gone through it at some point, so you have some point of reference.
Yeah.
Is that so? That would be like staying within your individuality and allowing them to have their experience.
So what we would do in this situation, we're having a conversation, is like you really would use validation in the sense of saying something along the lines of, I imagine that feels, and then you're kind of checking in with them and saying, I imagine that feels like you're really tired a lot. Did I get that? And then they would be able to say, oh, yes, totally, or no. Oh, well, tell me more. Tell me what it feels like. So it takes you into that deeper, and you're keeping the focus on the person that's speaking and sharing with you and letting them know that you're listening and you want to understand their experience, and that you have this willingness to step into that. Still keeping, your individuality in it and not making their story your story, or bringing up your pain body and experiencing your pain body with them, because that's really just two people isolated within an experience trying to get attention or validation for their suffering.
Sure. And just to clarify, if you could just maybe touch upon what pain body is. Everybody may not be familiar with that term.
The pain body is really the term that I use for, triggers that we have, or when we feel something that brings up a deep sense of something that we believe about ourselves. And it's what I call a wound, really. And so it's just stepping into owning your own and accepting that, and not shaming yourself for whatever you might believe about yourself. That obviously, that's a different discussion about the 7 major identifiers of wounds that seem to trigger us. I mean, we learned in childhood and we bring into our experiences.
All right. And then, did you want to say anything else about empathy or sympathy?
Well, empathy, like we said earlier, is a component of compassion, but it's only a part, and I want to make sure that everybody understands that. Okay, so in and of itself, empathy is just simply having your own feelings about somebody else's story, right? And so, and then it, as we hear it, and then bringing our own emotions about their pain and making it our pain. Actually, we're triggering our own emotional pain. And then we actually think we're identifying with them, but actually we're identifying with our own pain. So we're really at a disservice in the sense if we only stay in empathy. And that's really what it is. But empathy also is required to have emotional intelligence attached to it in order to practice compassion. So that means not, like we spoke earlier, not getting lost in the story with the other person, but being able to set aside going, oh yeah, I can imagine that feels this way or that way, and giving them space to express their pain.
All right. I wanted to maybe start touching upon about when practicing compassion, it's about being able to accept the person where they're at and not being judgmental about who or what they're feeling, and allowing them to have their experience. Is I believe that's part of it, is just accepting them where they're at.
Yes, and this is a hard thing because most people are trained to, I mean, in American society, as I have experienced, is people want to fix you, and they do it with an intent, hopefully with an intention of love. But what this does is minimize or makes the other person not take responsibility for their things, especially if whatever the fixer is suggesting doesn't work. Then they can't experience the trueness of making their own choices and the responsibility which lies in the freedom. Right? Another word for responsibility is freedom, and the word I want to come back to is the word that you use, judgment. So judgment is really important to understand. For me, what's the opposite of that, and that is curiosity. And curiosity is a part of compassion. So instead of making a judgment about a person's like, oh, you're always sick, is to really dig in there if you want to be that person for them and be that soundboard that they feel safe with. Another thing I do want to point out is it's very important to have self-compassion. So if you have a coworker or a family member that is continually has a practice of not feeling good, or it feels draining, or you have beliefs about them, it may not be true, but it's true for you, to be able to state to them, and this is part of compassion, is being totally honest about, I can't be that person for you because I can tell that I cannot listen to you without judgment. And I don't have a curiosity to why you're feeling sick, and I have beliefs around that. And so that might be tough to say, but it's really not loving to say, yes, you'll listen, and then you start fixing them, and you start, trying to maybe minimize it or maybe over dramatize it with them, depending where you step in. And it's a disservice to both of you because you both go down the rabbit hole together, and you don't feel connected, and you don't feel loved, and you have that illusion, that veil of separation, and it's really taking responsibility for the space between and any of the connections that we have.
Sure. And so it sounds like that what you're speaking about really, when you say fixing, is like opinions. And it, I remember reading something about opinions versus compassion, where one's the lowest form of what's the word they used? I guess
a vibration.
Yes,
it's a low vibration.
Yes, thank you. And where compassion would be the opposite of it. Is that what you're talking about? Is where you're providing information where it's not needed? But I also have to say that, like you said, from the experience, just from being in the society that we're in, it's almost expected from the person that is complaining or asking for help that they almost want that fix,
Well, yeah,
because then they're not to take away the responsibility, because it's the finger point. Well, so and so said, hey, so that's why I did it this way, instead of really just taking it as an opinion
or a choice.
Or a
choice is probably a better word. Yeah.
And so I find, I mean, I can kind of picture in your head, it's kind of like the gossiper in the office, or you come home with your stories. Everybody has stories, and you got to vent. I get it.
Yeah.
But for me, I got people popping in my head going, yeah, I can kind of see where that comes in.
Yeah.
Is that kind of what you're talking about when you're talking about, are you getting into the gossiping part of it, or are you just talking like when somebody's actually in a place of, we'll call it suffering, because it could be a little bit of suffering or a lot of suffering.
Yeah. Well, we create our own, my belief is we create our own suffering, meaning that we're just not ready to let go of the story. I'm not negating that there's not pain involved in whatever, the pain that comes through when we're triggered, but the suffering is really about really a non-attachment to the story. And it's very hard because it's that blanket is what softens us, right? And so we use the blanket to soften the blow of the pain and of the emotional blanket to blanket the feeling that comes up, because there's a huge difference between what emotions and feelings are, and we'll talk about that also at a different time. But the thing is opinions, like you stated, are really just guys' judgments. And so how that looks, if you're going through unconditional loving principles, if somebody shares an opinion with you without your expression of asking them for helping them to maybe see different choices, is really a form of an attack. And what that really means is a duality. It creates duality between the two, meaning, well, I'm right and you're wrong, obviously, so here's my opinion, and if you do it, then this would happen. That's not a guarantee, but it's a fast fix, it's a Band-Aid, and the person receiving the opinion of and it could be really good information. I'm not saying that all opinions are judgmental, but when somebody gives information without the person expressly asking for it, it really, on a subconscious level, is heard as they're right and I'm wrong, or I'm right and they're wrong, depending on how you show up in that receiving end of that. And
so if you don't, like I always say, if they want your opinion, they'll ask. Otherwise, you don't need to say anything.
Yeah, and it's hard not to, especially if it's people close to our partnerships, our children, co-workers that we're close to, and maybe we get caught up in the story at work or between siblings, or it's a very mindful practice. And it's like, for me, I used to have the urge so strong to want to fix, and even as you move through it and you start seeing the obvious, like, wow, I didn't realize how much opinions I gave. So really, for one day, I would really encourage people to not give any opinions or advice unless they're asked, and you'll be amazed how often you're not asked for it.
You're not talking very much.
Yeah, you're not talking very much, and so that will give you a real indication that people really just want to be listened to.
Well, I have a question, because there are fixers out there.
Yes.
There's a lot of them.
Yes.
What is it that they're, just so you have kind of the full scope, what are they getting out of it? We're talking about the receiver, whether they ask for it or not, or receiving the information. How about the giver, the person that's giving the information? What's the fixer getting out of this? What's getting, hit for them when they give their opinion? Is it... because it obviously is not compassionate. It's a different type of...
Well, it really depends on the intention of why they're giving that opinion. Obviously, it's through love, but sometimes it's through power and overpower. Like, if you just do what I say, right? Yeah. Or you can have the nurturer fixer who's like, I just love you, honey, and I just want... But really, that's about control, and they don't want to deal with you, so they're trying to control their environment, their emotional environment, and they really don't want to take the space to be compassionate, being curious. They just want to fix it and move on. So they're the doers. That's like, let's just do it and get out of my way. I love you, but move, right? Or don't whine. And the person whining or whatever is really just looking for somebody to say, I see you, and tell me tell me more, or what choices do you have? Or you can ask somebody, would you like me to share?
And so this is where the part of being honest with yourself and honest with them is like, I have the capacity to hear this, or I really have no interest in hearing anything you have to say, because in a nice way, I don't care. Is basically what you're telling them.
Well, it's not that you don't care, but you might be in
that moment, you're not interested in that story.
Well, it's not that you're not interested, but you could say also, you may be in the capacity where you're dealing with your own stuff internally.
True. Yeah.
And so you're just like, oh man, you cannot take on one more thing, right? Or hear one more thing, because you're already at capacity. Let's say you're at work, and to have another, story of, needing validation, it's like, man, I don't have it in me. I love you, but and what you could do in this situation too is if you really do want to hear, like, there is an expression in which is like, I really don't care, and that's totally fine. But if you really do want to hear, but you're not at capacity, the most loving thing you can do is like, hey Faye, I really want to hear you, and right now I have so much inner turmoil, I'm not able to listen. Would you like to talk about this at another time? I can talk to you in 2 hours or tomorrow. Would that work for you?
Yeah, so set an appointment.
Set an appointment
Set
with
an
them.
appointment, and
Yeah.
hopefully they'll have time, and now they keep it or not, but at least you're honoring them.
Yeah, and they know that I care, and I'm giving them the choice whether or not they want that from me, and I'm willing to give that to them. So this is really just a practice, really about self-compassion, because we really have to start with ourselves and do a lot of inner check-in to make sure, because it's important that we know how it feels to be loving for ourselves. Because if you don't know what it feels like, then how could you possibly show up for somebody that is in need of compassion from you? So the best place to start the practice is with yourself, and really that's about, like you said, being honest. When you're lying, you really can't lie to yourself, because you know I know that you can be in denial. I get that, but you know the truth of who you are. You know your intentions. You know where you're coming from, and what it is really just stepping into, hey, yeah, I'm not a perfect human being, and I know that, but I accept that about myself. And I was like, oh, I get another day to try. Gratitude comes in. It's like, wow, I really messed that up, and I'm taking responsibility for that. Or it's like, wow, did I really act like a victim in that? Oh, well, that's okay. This is what I learned about myself, and this is what I'm gaining, and now I'm going to move forward. And then the next time it comes up, because it always does, I'll have more awareness about how to navigate through it.
Yeah, I've been there more than once.
I think we've all been there, yeah.
But I'm okay with it. I was like, I was kind of an ass. I'm okay with that,
Yeah, but it's okay, because we've learned from it. And sometimes we can go back and do the cleanup. That's about forgiveness.
And I've done that too.
Yeah, and then sometimes you just release and let it go, because there isn't a space to go back, just because of the dynamics of that partnership or relationship. And it would be more unkind to go back and do cleanup than it would just to move forward.
Okay. Well, do you have anything else you want to add? I think we kind of touched upon each of these things. Was there something else you wanted to add to that, or?
Well, just in review, so I just want to say that there is 5 ingredients, because we talked about each one, but I just want to make it very clear maybe what they are. So the first one is individual identity, and so that's where our personal identity is retained, right? Where we talk about being able to recognize other people's but not taking their feelings on. So that's really important in compassion, in the practice of compassion. The second one is honesty, and of course that's honesty to self, and then honesty with the other person. And that doesn't mean you get to be brutal in your truthfulness. Use discernment, use kindness. Kindness is part of compassion. You can say no in a loving way, in a firm way, and in a direct way, and not attack the other person or make them wrong for however they're showing up in your life. And another one we kind of talked about was acceptance, and it really talks about self-acceptance. It's really the key to compassion, and without it, real acceptance of another is really impossible. So we want to make sure we got that down too. And then empathy, of course, we talked extensively about that. And then, of course, willingness is compassion requires a willingness to stay in the relationship and for whatever arises, instead of getting triggered and running. Now you can take breaks. It's called a strategic withdrawal in a loving way. That's where we're talking about making an appointment and come back. And so if you're in a conversation with somebody that's like an intimate partner or maybe a sibling or somebody, and it's getting really heated, and if you both have enough awareness to know, just like, we need to stop right here, and we're going to take a breath, and we'll come back in 15 minutes, and then let's see if we can talk about it, or maybe tomorrow, or however you want to do it. But that's really being loving toward each other and yourself, because at the end of the day, we want to be seen and loved and accepted for who we are through our truth, and that does require all these steps through compassion.
That's a lot of information.
I know. I know.
Well, I know there's a lot more. This is just the tip of the iceberg.
It is.
There's always a lot of information out there, and of course, if you're interested in looking that stuff up, there's Google, and of course, there's barbhite.com.
Yep.
You can also find Just Blah at justblah.com, and also Just Blah on Facebook. And if you really want to ask any questions or have any comments, hopefully constructive, you can email us at justblahus@gmail.com. And I think that's about about going to wrap it up unless you have any last thoughts.
Yeah, my last thought might be that I wanted to say one more thing about compassion. And compassion is really not a spectator sport, and you really have to engage in it and in practice it. Compassion motivates all our other behaviors. So if we'll have the willingness, like I said, to show up and practice all those others, then it will outflow eventually.
Yeah, and make sure that you practice compassion because you're gonna need it someday too.
Well, a lot of people do, and they don't recognize it. Yeah, they don't recognize it. A lot of people do.
What goes around comes around. So
Absolutely,
yeah,
absolutely.
All right, I guess with that we are complete.
Peace out.